All right, we're going to go ahead and bring the speakers back up. We'll do Q&A right now with that. So if you want to ask a question of any of the speakers, just ask your question and indicate which speaker you're asking the question to. And then we'll go ahead and do that. Once we're done with the Q&A, we'll dismiss them. And then Jason, Dr. Ross will lead us in the open discussion part of this. So any questions for the speakers? All right, right up front here. Right up front? If you want to wait. Okay, there we go. Very good.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Very interesting session, to say the least. So the question is for Eli. Eli? You said that there is a significant difference in retention rate in gills bred at the GDU versus the gills bred at the sow farms. Can you elaborate on that? Why the difference? Or if you don't have a specific reason, any educated guess?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we had a 27% reduction in retention rate in gills bred in the sow farm as compared to GDUs. My chart with the system is this mainly reflects what the system operations is at the GDU. And my answer to that would be ensuring that we are improving gilt development will be sustainable to sustain those gilts to later stages. And so the selection of the GDU and the attention of staff there as compared to the sow farm may explain that.
I have two questions, one for Laura and one for Dr. Lara. Laura, the first question I have is, I think you indicated about 86% of those pigs had some level of gastric lesions. Is that indicative that majority of the pigs in those populations have gastric lesions, but most of them are subacute?
It's on? Okay, sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Yep. I think in the data you presented, it shared that about 86% of those pigs had gastric lesions. Would that indicate that the majority of the population has some level of subacute gastric lesions? You just don't know it because we haven't necropsied them?
Yes. Oh, thank you very much for your question. If I understood correctly, yes, we saw that with all these necropsies, in this data it was 186. 86% had any grade of stomach ulcers between grade 1, that is the most moderate, that is just like a parakeratosis in the pars esophageal of the no glandular area of the stomach, moderate grade 2 or grade 3, that is the most severe. So that is that's why I just wanted to emphasize how gastric ulcers, besides if they die by a primary cause, that is also present in the other sows that die by another reasons as a secondary finding. So it's something that just to keep in mind, so because it has different reasons, multifactorial, that we can, like the sows can develop gastric ulcers. So it could be like the size of the particle of the feed, or also management and stress. So that is something like maybe we can start working more about the management and the stress, to reduce the stress, to reduce the feed disruptions on the animals. How are we dropping feed early in the morning? Something that easy to start, just to start investigating more why these animals have gastric ulcers.
Thank you. Dr. Lara, you mentioned that you were including soluble fiber in those diets. Do you have an amount of soluble fiber that you would recommend formulating? And where are you sourcing your soluble fiber?
The source is soy, but the inclusion we have a variation, and I'll have to bring the nutritionist here to discuss a little bit more about that. But we run some trials about that, and we compare at the same systems, and we saw this improve in the feed intake, so that's why we adopt that.
Are you processing the soy in a certain way to get the amount of fiber you're looking for?
Yes. Yes, that's it. Sorry, I missed the English in English.
Yeah, thank you for your presentations this morning. And my question is for maybe the first two presenters today, but in terms of gilt female retention, any indication of the promotion rate from the gilt pool to either the GDU or the sow barn, and what that rate, does that rate of selection to be promotion to be a sow affect the retention of those females later on?
Thank you for the question. If I understood the question, you're asking if selection and targeted selection do affect retention later on. Yes, I think it does, depending on, especially in the GDU with specific management procedures put in place with targeted breeding would affect.
I don't remember which one did the presentation, but there was a discussion on high pig retention in those later parities. What was the primary cause of that? Was it due to the sows being in poor condition, or was there any other primary factors that caused that pig retention?
By retention, you mean retained pigs?
Yeah, retained pigs. They didn't farrow.
Okay, so the retained pig, let's see. Okay. So yes, as we noticed, and I think so it's very similar with the results of Dr. Lara, like the gilts parity 1 and parity 2 is the highest mortality rate, and they show some about retained piglets more in parity 1 and 2. That could be related to different factors, but also body condition. So after we develop a gilt, that's why it's very important how do we develop the gilt. And also it was more like Juan Carlos' question about why do we have better results in the GDU than in the sows. So probably it could be like the management that we did at the beginning. So in the GDU, what is happening, they have the animals and they have this acclimatization. So it's reducing the stress, and they can have a better selection of the animals before breeding them, and probably they can have an HNS before. So after they are sending the animals, pregnant sows, to the farm, so they already have that management. Versus the ones that are in the sow farm that they are arriving pregnant, so all that process of stress, and sometimes they are arriving a couple weeks before farrowing. So with the stress event of the farrowing before, and also the arriving to the farm, that is causing a lot of stress. They are off feed, and that could cause like the problem of farrowing. Maybe they will farrow and do not have any problem of retention, but the next parity, when they are coming back to breeding, in which conditions are they coming back? So, and with the pressure of breeding targets, as we see, there are a lot of animals dying, the younger animals, so it's the breeding target pressure, it's a lot. So probably you have to breed whatever, even if they are in very low body conditions. So that's why it's another consequence after when they are farrowing on the second time, and they can have some issues with the retention.
Then a follow-up on that, it looked like it was certain times of the year you would have spikes. Is that primarily used to heat stress still? Or did you see it in extreme temperatures, high and low?
Yes, yes. Like we saw, like for example, in retained piglets, it's more often to see them in transitional seasons, like the change of the temperatures on the farrowing rooms. So what is management before loading the animals? So also we can consider the pressure of these, like to load the animals, like do not farrow in gestation. So that's kind of details we can just start imagining that it can influence by these problems of retentions in the transitional season. So it could be also the temperature for sure, yes, how in which moment during the day we are loading the animals also, and yes, so that could be also related.
Yeah, thank you all for excellent presentations. There was some mention of induction in the last presentation, and I'm wondering how much induction is occurring and what have been, on a deeper level, what have been your observations with induction as it relates to some of these other issues like retained piglets and mortality?
Yeah, well, and Laura, you can talk about too, induction or oxytocin usage. Okay.
So just to understand the question, your question is about decreasing the intervention and the farrowing room, yes?
You guys do much induction?
Okay, yeah. So we used to do a lot of induction to finish the farrowing room. So we started not to do that, and we know that the gestation age is increasing. So, and that was something that we need to understand that we do not have the same profile that we have some years ago. So in this specific site, we are not performing induction anymore. So in the south, it's more controlled, but we know that we have some risk factors different in those sites, so we are not doing that. So far, it's going well. We can see a better, the soil, it's better after farrowing, after weaning. We do not have enough data now to bring here and to share, but we are still taking a look on that. And also about the higher temperature, we again review all the process. What are we doing, especially in the guilds, that because when we saw those data, we were surprised about that number. So we are trying to understand that and focus on reviewing all the process for intervention, yes. And also, I agree with Lara in the previous comment, and I don't know if you had time to see, but the fourth or fifth cause in our system was retention, fetus retention. So it's an issue, and we need to understand that better.
Yes. Okay, yes, just to give it a little more about the inductions protocols in this farm. But well, yes, they were inducing. There are some change on the induction protocols. So some of the farms are inducing at 115 days. But it's also very important, like one of the slides I present that the average gestation length was 117 days. So there are some studies that are finding that inducing more than 2 days, it can affect the survivability of the piglets, no? So that's why they are changing that, and also the use of the oxytocin. So just to keep in mind, like not every sow can be a candidate to apply the oxytocin. There needs to have some other things like a sleep curve before, just to see if everything all right and it's nothing obstructed.
Again, I want to echo my appreciation for the solid data that's been shared this morning, so thank you for your time. This question will be for Anna de Lara. Regarding your findings on your necropsy surveillance and the number of organ torsions that were reported. Obviously, you probably expected a question on this. Do you have a cause or a reason? Is it group housing related, or just be interested in your perspective?
So this is a very good question, and we came back to the first week of gestation to understand if there's any issue about that. So we review the time that we are transferring those sows, how we are transferring that in the group of maximum 5. So we review all this process. We still don't have a very clear answer to that, but we are enhancing our efforts, especially on the first week where we manage the group housing. Pre-implantation especially is in this site. But also when we combined, we grouped these causes, it was a surprise also to be the first one, because if we don't group that, you keep separated, and then, but we are trying to work trying to do our best in the first week, but we still don't have a clear answer about that.
To follow up slightly on that, Dr. Lara, so out of curiosity, in gestation, would you guys drop feed one time or multiple times during the day? And has that ever changed since you added soluble fiber? Thank you.
We are currently dropping in some farms twice and trying to compare when we drop one to see if this could reduce stress and it could get any better. Still don't have that answer to. But in the gestation, our standard procedure in all farms, it's one. But in this case, we try to.
So in this case, in these farms, they were dropping feed only once per day in gestation. And just coming back to the last question, there are very similar results, intestinal and splenic disorders. And the other thing, in gestation, you have more cases than in farrowing. But I don't know, for example, in our data, how we divided on peripartum period, that it's including the last part of gestation. So it's 110 days until farrowing and the rest of the lactation period. So that it could be also probably the numbers that you have, and it could be also very similar, they have more incidence on the peripartum period. And in case of the intestinal, yes, it's a big one. We notice more in case of the death causes of death during the peripartum period. We have a chart, it's especially during the first 7 days after farrowing, the intestinal and splenic disorders appear just after farrowing.
Okay. I missed the first question. If you could repeat that, please. But I'm going to answer the second one first, and then you repeat it. So the second question about the water quality in Brazil. We have some issues about the water. So this is something that we take a look, and in this special case, we took a look. In this region, the water quality is very good, and with enough supply. So this is not an issue in the Midwest of the country. We have some regions in the south of the country that we have, and we need to, it's mandatory to have, depending on the source of the water, we need to have a treatment system inside each farm. But it's not the case of the Midwest. So if you could repeat about the
Do you have the ability to feed second, more nutrient-dense diet to the gills in your farm? Okay.
for the gills?
Yeah, for because all your P1s have lost so much weight. Do you have the ability?
No.
Okay.
No, I do not.
Like
No.
in lactation, if there's...
No, it's the same.
Yeah.
No.
I know it's difficult to do, but I was just wondering if there'd been any attempt or success in that area with some of these large farms.
Yes, I'm not a nutritionist, but if Dr. Cacciani was listening here, she would agree with you, because she always asks about that additional line to provide this feed. So, but unfortunately, we are not able to do that.
Hi, my question is for Tricia. Thank you for your great presentation. I would like to know what are your thoughts, or how do you explain the association between 12 farms have a higher perineal score? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think part of that within this study specifically is just looking at how those sows are managed, and is there a difference between the management and moving them into groups earlier? Is that potentially causing extra stress factors or other things that then, as they go throughout gestation within those, maybe causing an effect there? And then also, depending on how we're forming those groups, whether we're putting sows that fight a lot together and there's a lot of competition within those groups, or if we're managing those and also with body condition. Are we equally balancing body condition within those groups, or is there big differences?
Okay, one more question.
Hi, Tricia. I had a question on what you just commented on. So in the open pen gestation, do you often see, because you talked about behavior in that, and mostly thin sows getting picked on, and does that have an effect on prolapses?
So kind of like a similar question to the perineal score, like does behavior and interactions affect prolapse rate? Yeah, I definitely think that there needs to be more work and further studies within prolapses, but I think behavior is probably a potential with the amount of environmental effect regarding towards prolapse differing from genetics, that there might be potentially something within behavior that's adding extra stress to cause prolapse.
All right, let's thank our speakers again for their excellent presentation. Yes, you go right ahead. Thank you. All right, I'm going to give the mic over to my esteemed colleague. We're going to spend the rest of the time now to get some feedback from you guys, from the audience, about what you guys think, what you've heard, what we need to be working on for the remainder of this next grant.
All right, yeah, so this is where the audience participation increases greatly. I think one of the things that we can continue to build off of those topics and conversations that we were just having, but really this is an opportunity to share your observations in your farms and your production systems, and what you think works, what you think is not working. But then also, as Chris just indicated, this is an important conversation as the group gets together on a monthly basis and talks about the projects that should be upcoming as part of the Pig Livability Project. So I'll open it up there and ask if anybody has any particular comments to get it rolling.
So the induction cycle, I mean, we go, everybody induces, nobody induces. And the day she made the point that the gestation length is longer. And we see that in almost every genetic line. You're going to have more pigs, it's going to be a longer gestation length. And yet we're holding our induction back because if we don't do it soon enough, the farm doesn't see the response. But then there's an indication that maybe there's a relationship to mortality. So is there an opportunity to do a study to look at induction and mortality? I just think it's probably something that could be useful for the industry.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I'll go back to the survey that was referenced in a couple of the talks that we did in 2018 time period. And we went on to roughly, I think 60 some sow farms we visited across the country. And when the group would go in there, we looked at sow cards in every farrowing room and looked at the percentage of the sows that were induced and the percentage that weren't induced for every farm. And so we sampled about 100 to 150 sow cards at each of these farms, about 5,000 sows in total. And then that was when we were collecting weekly mortality data. And what we saw is that there's huge variation across the industry. There's a lot of farms that had a 0% induction, and there's other farms that would have 70, 80, 90% of the sows being induced. And we saw no relationship at that time to mortality on those sows that were receiving induction. So we were looking at individual sow cards and then tracking which sows showed up on our mortality sheets. So we didn't see it then. That doesn't, even in the last 6 years, things have continued to change. The sow's more productive than she was 6 years ago, too. So did you look at it by parity, too? We did not look at that by parity, yep. It looks like if you're dealing with the problem Right. And I don't think, and at that time too, farms that we were visiting were not allocating their induction protocol by parity. Yeah, good point, yeah.
So it looked to me like from yesterday and today discussion, obviously lameness is a big piece within the sow operations, and having kind of not a lot of data or a lot of understanding on group sow housing in the flooring. And it looks to me, think of groups, to me the first thing I thought of with the group sows is they're all coming into estrus at the same time, so they're riding each other, and so whether you're the one being ridden or the one that's doing the riding, feet and what kind of surface area they're on, whether to knock off a dew claw or whatever can cause soundness based on the surface that they're on, whether it's even how slick the surface is or how rough, whether it's slats or it's solid. Has there been any look at flooring, particularly in group sow housing, to lameness management and things like that?
I don't think, I'm gonna look at the others on the group here, but I don't think that we've seen anything as far as flooring type. The extent of what the work you saw today and the work that's been done in the past has really been looking at comparisons between stalls and groups and then group size. So I think you're right, we all saw the videos yesterday. Sows certainly have preferences on what they like to be on and how they travel, but it's something that we need to explore.
We are in the process of doing an open pen gestation survey, so a little bit similar, but a little bit different than what Hyatt talked about yesterday. So we're in the process. We've just been reaching out to some producers. So if you have producers, have farms, you're interested in it and participating in it, come see me after this session and we'll make sure to get the survey to you. And it's just a real simple survey to ask questions like that. Some of the things that Hyatt was talking about yesterday. What's the group size? What's the stocking density? When do you mix them? And then we're just asking for a little bit of data, and then we'll have our talented graduate students run those through multivariable models to see if there's any relationships like that. So that's a great point, but that'd be a good way to help ferret that question out a little bit to see if that's something we need to invest further resources in on a more controlled research study.
Who else?
I realize this is for applied, but might there be some early diagnostics that you might be able to employ? If you talk to Lance Baumgard, might he have some things that you can do sow side easily that you can say, hey, these pigs might be in trouble. It might just be a subset of the population to give you an idea what the representation is overall.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have done some of that work. Zoe, ever since I went into academic administration, Zoe's been the extension of my brain, so I have to look at her sometimes. We have done some studies that we'll be publishing soon that, we really looked at, similar to Tricia's study, high risk and low risk sows and prior to farrowing, and then collected a large group of blood samples, and then went back and after they either prolapsed or didn't prolapse, went back and analyzed those sows and compared. And there are some blood markers that are different. We've seen things like increased levels of LPS binding protein in circulation. There's shifts in the vaginal microflora. There's other molecules that are in circulation that would be differentially abundant in sows that are at risk. The problem with a lot of those studies still at this point is understanding whether or not those differences that we see in the blood are causative problems or indicative of the result. So that's really where we need to still continue to tease out that mechanism.
So we were talking earlier about it looks like employee turnover is about as high as sow turnover. And so I guess the question is yesterday there was discussion about employee training. I know the JBS crew was talking about how they do better training for those employees. Has there been any studies of what are basic protocols, whether talking about the choring and all those things, but is there certain types of things that can be put together to say, hey, here's a proper basic protocol for your new employees, so they're getting properly trained and they're not just learning by trial by fire and you causing a lot of problems just because you have such big turnover?
Good question. Or do you have an answer to that? That might even be better. Okay. Okay. I was hoping does anybody have an answer to the last question is what I was hoping while he was asking it. You know, it's a good point. And I think we saw some talks yesterday, right, that indicate different system strategies on how to assign responsibilities, how to educate and train employees. You know, the new farm startup that 2/3 of the employees had no pig experience. You know, I think that's not unique to that farm. I think that's something that we see across the industry as well. And so there is an increasing need to consistently train employees. And that's one of those things that's, you know, I don't know where the research around that would go or where the extension efforts would go around that, but I really think that's one of the things that there could probably be greater communication on across the industry on what success looks like in that area, because everybody has their own training program, their own onboarding program, and so there probably should be an increased dialogue between everybody at the table on what success looks like in that and what employee retention looks like in pork production. Anybody have anything to add to that? Okay.
Just an additional comment. This is actually part of our experience in country view during the last 5 years, I will say. Other than remodeling all our training programs, we did a big effort trying to look into, I don't know, improve retention of team members, but also having team members doing the best. So we create an onboarding program that is a formal 2-week process and then a step plan of 4 levels, etc. That make a big change. But the important piece, other than remodeling materials, is the execution. So actually today in our system, the training index that we have by farm, that is made out of the weighted average of different levels by team member, is part of the production scorecard. So in a weekly basis, we are keeping track on by farm, what's the level of knowledge and training each farm has, and also the execution of the onboarding, which is critical. When we fail onboarding people for 2 weeks properly, our turnover goes up. So the execution piece is pretty important, and we need to make it part of the general production scorecard, where we have different KPIs, mortality, farrowing rates, etc. We have training index of team members.
I think that the one thing Dr. Lara brought up is very important because we look at it in body conditioning on farms. If there's one person responsible, it gets done because they're held accountable. When you have 4 people responsible, you get terrible results. And so I think we always, if you think it in management, you sit there and say, well, I can't afford a sow care specialist. Well, maybe you can. You don't want to, it doesn't have to be that you add somebody on, but you have to make somebody responsible for it. Or maybe you do have to add somebody on. That's their sole responsibility. They're the champion, because we all know if you don't have a champion in a research project or anything, nothing happens. And you don't, when you go back and say, who's responsible, there's 4 people say, I didn't do it. When there's one person, you're responsible. So I think that's part of the answer. Switching gears a little bit, and I'm going to let Tokash answer this, but gastric ulcers, all right? Are they starting when they're in the nursery? And is there the simple test that you can say, this is indicative of a gastric ulcer?
Well, I mean, gastric ulcers can start very quickly, and so I wouldn't blame them there on the nursery. What happens, though, I was thinking about that with the presentations, and I mean, and one of the things, it was very interesting that those were very common in terms of gastric ulcers being a major problem, and I think it is an issue on a lot of our farms, especially anytime. But you have to remember, though, anytime an animal goes off feed for any reason, ulcers start very quickly, and when they're on a pelleted diet, they don't repair the ulcer very quickly, and so when they're on a MASH diet or there's more fiber in the diet, they can repair the ulcer much more quickly. And so, so any auto-feed event, for whatever reason, the ulcers, if you look at a pig in a packing plant, a very high percentage of them have ulcers. But it's not that they've had ulcers their whole life. It's that they develop ulcers very quickly when they're off feed and they have empty stomach. And so that's been seen in a number of studies.
I'll add to that just a little bit. Dr. Eric Weaver did a project for us looking at basically a feed system audit, developing an auditing for feed system, right? Because it goes back to the conversation, Mike, that you and I had about what percentage of feed that is manufactured that never gets eaten by a pig. It's somewhere north of 10%, which is a shocking value, right? We're just dumping 10% of our feed into the pit. But when he did that, one of the outcomes for that project was that there is a shocking number of pigs that experience, the vast majority of the pigs that go to market in the US experience at least one and probably multiple out-of-feed events during their lifetime. It's really, really high. I forget what the number is, but it's north of 70%. So it wouldn't be too surprising to slaughter pigs and look at gastric ulcers and find at least stage 1s there.
So one comment or question would be, following what Carlos said, we could have the best nutrition programs, best vaccination programs, but it comes to execution. Part of maybe the research we can do is understanding the social behavior at the farm. So what prevents people from executing things? And most of the time it's going to be fatigue or not knowing something. And so maybe understanding what those dynamics within the farrowing room, the gestation room, what they look like, and when does the employee get tired that even though he wants to do a good job, they won't. So that may even relate to decreasing turnover and performance. But of course, it takes coordination of people that know about those subjects and, of course, operations.
That's a great point. Yeah, caretaker fatigue is a real thing in human medicine as well.
Yeah, so I was wondering, the presentations seem to focus on primary reasons, but wondering about comorbidities or associations. Is it lameness causing the reduction in feed intake, or is it an animal getting sick, reducing feed intake, and that leads to lameness? Just looking at comorbidities. And then it appeared from the one presentation that the lameness prevalence for a reason increased in the later parodies, like 2 or 3. And so maybe some longer-term nutrition studies, on CalFOS. I know Dr. Stein recently has come up with new estimates for CalFOS in sows, and they seem to be higher in calcium than what we've been doing as an industry. So longer-term nutrition studies in sows, I know that's not easy, but wondering if looking at nutrition and how we can maybe prevent some of that later lameness and later parodies, if there's any way of doing that.
Great comments. I'll look over here to the nutritionists. Anybody want to add to that? Laura, Mike? They're in agreement over here. No rebuttal.
Yeah, I was going to ask to add to that, John, the same concept, and this is coming from a non-nutritionist, so the nutritionist in the room, I'm just asking to follow up to that. Are we meeting the requirements of the highly prolific sow today based on Stein's work that just came out on the CalFOS, Dr. Eric Weaver's really early work on vitamins, minerals, and Dr. Mark Knauer's out of NC State showing some pretty impressive impacts on sow retention and productivity? Kind of brings the just general question of, are we meeting the nutritional requirements of today's very prolific sow?
Well, the answer is we don't know. I mean, that's the reality. There was, that, like, John's question was a good one in terms of longevity studies. It's just, as everybody knows, those are very difficult studies to do and very expensive to do, and so there's not very many of them ever been done. There's most of the trial. There's a number of good studies about, that show impacts on osteochondrosis and on some of the factors that we think will impact their long-term longevity in the herd, we're not applying all the things we've learned from those studies across the industry. And so I think there's a need for us to put those things into practice. The other problem when you start designing one of those trials, when you're going to go through 3 or 4 parodies, is there's so many things you'd like to look at. So it's trying to narrow it down to what are you actually going to test that you can get done and look at. There's no question we need to do that work. It's just extremely hard to do. We don't have, I don't know of almost any facility set up in the U.S. that you can follow multiple diets over multiple parodies and keep it straight in a production system. We need those facilities.
And some of the other things we've been talking about are vitamins and minerals a lot lately. And if you look at the NRC, right, a lot of that data was done in the 1950s, 1970s, and I believe our animals are definitely a little bit different than when we had them then. But one of the things I even find is interesting is we've talked to individuals like Dr. Crenshaw working on vitamin A deficiency, how many parodies we have to go through in order to get that sow to be truly deficient in a vitamin A status before we can even do a vitamin A study to look at requirements. And so it goes back to cost and time. There's definitely interest. I would say the nutrition community all agrees that that's very valuable data, but who wants to fund it and who wants to help support it is probably one of our bigger challenges because, yeah, I think a lot of us would agree it's an absolute. And so, again, if there's groups that want to work with us on that, we're happy to engage in that. But we are going to need some longevity. We are going to have to see this over multiple parodies and a lot of times to see what we need to see to get those requirements set.
I wanted to add just one comment on it. Always also remember, more is not always better, and that's, I think, especially with trace minerals. There are some studies out there show that if you go too high in trace minerals with sows, you cause negative effects much more than positive effects, and so you always have to be careful in some of those. It's like, well, the sows are producing more pigs, and so we got to give them more trace minerals. That's not necessarily the case, but we just need those trials.
Yeah, there was recently a poster at the SDSU Swine Day, and they were looking at phase feeding gestation, so looking at late gestation feeding about 60 days, I don't remember exactly, but looking at that and increasing vitamin trace mineral levels and amino acid levels and showing some pretty significant improvements with making a change in the diet. And granted, it's not easy to do, but that's probably some work we need to think about, particularly on these sows. And you look at some of their anemia work, that we're dragging these sows down over time, and is that contributing to some of the issues that we're having? And are there some things we can do that may not be easy on the farm? But
right up here, Carlos.
Yeah, this is a comment, but from a production standpoint, I still have kind of a hard time accepting the fact that as an industry in general, we have recommendations for feeding sows basically based on gilts or sows, and then body condition, and that's it. That's a very simple approach. Today we have sows housed in pens of 4 animals per pen, up to 240 animals per pen. We have different parities, right, with animals from, I don't know, X amount of pounds up to 500 pounds or whatever, and they need to walk a lot, but we still feed animals like they are created, right? Like providing same amount of energy and nutrients, doesn't matter the different scenarios they are facing. I believe as an industry, we need to elaborate more on that. What's the right way? Today with the electronic system, we can be very accurate. We can feed animals even by, I don't know, average productivity, total born, you know? A sow that historically is giving me 12 pigs versus 16, 18, 20 pigs, why they need to be fed the same way? But we need to, today, like I was talking yesterday, we are facing a more complex problem, and we have the tools, but we are lagging on some knowledge, I think.
Can I react to that?
Good
because
points.
I'm very happy, here he's sitting, very happy that finally we come to the point that we take the pig as the starting point. The first 1.5 hours this morning, we try to think about how can we change our systems, but we don't think about what the pig actually needs. And I think that is the starting point. Example, we discussed induction. Forget about a standard operation procedure for induction. It does not exist. There is too much variation. We try to manage our pigs as machines, as robots. That is not the case. There is variation, and if you want good results, then you need to take into account that variation. You have to accept variation. You cannot work with just one number and that's it. And it's exactly what you're saying. So you have to look much, much better. What are the needs of the pig and start from that. And if I see all the numbers about the gastric problems, etc., that needs, we need to start thinking about it. Where is that coming from? Because that means that there's a hell of a lot of pig outs that are stressed, have other problems, etc., and how can we expect that those animals perform? This is simply not going to happen. So my question would be, can we turn it around? Can we think about new ways of production or adapting our systems? And I understand that we cannot accept or adapt to the maximum and that we can fulfill everything, but how can we adapt our systems to make sure that we can work with those variations, that we can take that into account and still make good money? Because let's be honest, we have to keep that in mind. But how can we work more towards what the pig actually needs?
Great points.
Ken Doyle, producer, South Central Illinois. As I look around the room, I should say old producer. It's nice to have the nutrition come up in its pile on time, if I may. As we have made these sows more and more productive and the pigs growing faster, we really haven't addressed, I think, some of the micros. We talk about lameness as one of the primary death loss reasons. I have the pleasure of dealing with our mortalities. We have feet that are broken down, and I believe it's a lack of proper nutrition, and I don't have the answers. Lameness, has anyone ever done a study on teeth in sows? If you want to see some bone issues, look at the dental needs of a sow. If we go back in time with people, one of the primary death reasons for people was infection through teeth. If you look at the teeth in sows, I think you'll get an eye-opener. I personally believe that we have a deficit in nutrition for developing bone and bone tissues, affiliated things, all that goes with it. Certainly don't have the answers, just have the observation, know what we see in production every day. Thank you.
Good points. Did we have somebody over here?
Yeah, I do think we need more work on the fiber piece too. It was interesting to hear about that. I remember attending a conference in Asia many years ago, and a guest speaker from Australia talked about gastric ulcers in sows, and he came to a conclusion based on his observations as a consultant that corn would result in more ulcers than feeding wheat or barley. And so I really think, you know, on the fiber piece, we need to understand more and start looking at some of those ingredients and how they impact digestive health.
Thank you. Other observations? Okay, we got another row, 2 rows back as well.
Now, to comment to that last point, I think this is one, and here's a geneticist talking about nutrition, so how bad can it be? But I think the fiber is one of the things that it makes a big difference between Europe and the Americas, for example, in the feed. And we do see a lot of problems here in North America, maybe also South America, that we do see not or much less in Europe. And if I listen well to the nutritionists over in Europe, they claim that it has a lot to do with fiber. And you can try to make your feed very rich and do the best to get maximum or minimum feed conversion. But you have to be careful in, well, what negative impact does it have, and are we not gaining a little bit and losing a lot?
Anything else on fiber here? Oh, sorry, right back here.
Not on fiber, just a comment. Yesterday, we heard that the economics of a sow farm are driven by fixed costs, right? So that means as long as you get more pigs out the door, economics of the sow farm makes sense. All of the things that we've been talking about, we at what point do we finally connect the economics of the sow farm to the reason that we breed her? We do not breed her for a weaned pig. We breed her for a full value market hog. We've known about solubility in sow diets having value for a very long time. I'd argue at least 10 years. But when I ask if it's being used, the answer is, it doesn't fit into my least cost. So until we can make a connection between why we're actually breeding the sow, I don't know how many of these things will actually ever get implemented, because there's that huge disconnect.
It's a good observation. I think there's, Clayton Johnson talked about doing these, calculations on whether or not to treat an animal, right? Well, that applies to all these other factors you're talking about as well, and even comes back to, identifying somebody brought up identifying a sow care specialist, and, can you afford to do that? Well, there's a lot of money in cull sow value, right? And would you use the $2 million mark was what you used, and one of the economic studies by Lee Schultz and Russ Eukin from several years ago as part of this project created a calculator. There's money to be recovered, and so with that, when you're not focused on driving down fixed costs, you can increase variable cost and get a return on it. I think there's a lot of groups that are showing that.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment back on the feet and legs issues. I mean, they are important, and lameness is certainly a major cause of death loss. But I think as you think of projects to look at going forward, to me, one of the things that always stuns me is that if we have producers that purchase select weight gilts, so they come in at 5 to 6 months of age, they'd be horrified if you told them they selected 95% of their gilts. But when we bring them in as isoweans, we can select 95% of our gilts and keep them because they're there and we've invested in them. And so it would be interesting to look at the relationship there, if that is adding to our lameness issues or some of those concerns, just because we aren't doing the routine culling we would have done when we had selects.
Yeah. So essentially, you're talking about is the gilt pool right-sized?
Is the gilt pool right-sized, and for some reason we think we can breed them all?
Right. Yeah. Right.
When I grow them, they're good.
Go ahead, Samuel. Chris?
So, which is what my question was to the panel earlier about selection rate, right? And a very wise man once stood up in 2017 during one of these meetings, and he said, Wayne Cast, if you know who I'm talking about, he said a geneticist, one of his genetics professors, is Wayne in the room? You tell the story much better than I would, Wayne. He said one of his genetics professors told him that for a 50% selection rate or promotion rate out of a gilt pool, there is 5% mortality associated with a 50% selection rate. And beyond that, the next 25% of the sows that shouldn't have been selected but did go, there's probably another 5% associated with them. So at a 75% promotion rate from a gilt pool, you're already at 10% sow mortality associated with them. And ever since PEDV, where is our selection rate been for the gilt pool in the United States? 95% at least, right? And so that's I think a really astute observation. Not only do those females die at a higher rate that shouldn't have been selected and promoted to be sows in the herd, but their offspring also have a larger mortality rate than those females that were in the first 50% of the cut. Now, we've never done that study, but I've wanted to do that study ever since Wayne stood up and said that in the meeting.
There's two more in that row.
The question I have, I really appreciate what Crystal said about least cost. There's just too much focus on that, and yes, I understand cost of production. I think we have to look at some of the research that's been done in the human industry, particularly on osteoporosis and stuff there. There's a direct relationship between calcium and magnesium and what takes place there, and nobody really focuses on that and what they do. And then there's also a relationship on osteoporosis on which hormones really do a functional deal to build that in. If you follow Dr. John Lee and some other people on that, it does. And I marked out yesterday there was over 18 comments about herd health. And herd health starts at the cellular level for what you're doing. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I guess there's going to be a huge percentage of people in here that have a dog and a pet. How many of you feed essential fatty acids to your dog? 95 to 98% of the people that have pets feed them to their dogs and their pets. And why do they do that? Because of longevity, herd health, and everything else. And we don't focus on some of the other basic parts of nutrition to do that. It costs money. It's not in the part of least cost, but it produces animal health, and health is the key to profitability and performance.
Thinking about feeding dogs and pets, one of the things that I think is also true is that for whatever reason people tend to spend more money on feed for their pets than for themselves. But that's another thing. So I think publicity does a lot over there. I want to go back a little to the selection rate. I think if you want to look at the impact of selection, of the percentage of selection of gilts, you really have to take an holistic approach. If you are a multiplier and selling gilts, as long as your customer is not complaining, you will just do whatever you want. And the impact of selection only has value if the animals are not optimally developed as a gilt with a look on the long future. Every integrated system should look at the development of gilts as an investment in the future, should do everything they can to produce a good gilt, high quality, good legs, etc., and not save a penny on that part. And then I think you can really go to high levels of positively selected animals without the damage. But it all depends on how much money are you willing to invest in that gilt. So be aware, if you do a research, because I'm not saying that you should not do, but if you do a research, take into account how much money is invested in the development of that gilt. Because you can get out any result that you want.
Excellent.
Yeah, my comments, or I guess ideas, kind of follow that very nicely. I know there's been some work on slowing gilt growth. The data today is pretty strong that weight and age are pretty damn important. But so what is the right growth rate? You know, because again, I think Lara in Iowa State's done a little bit of work too, looking at slowing gilt growth a little bit and seeing some benefit. But I don't know if we have all of the answers yet. But with such a high mortality in these young females, I think the GDU, that's where I think there should be some investment in more research and gilt development. And even the difference between the GDU that was shown and shipping them to the sow farm, I mean, that's an indication there's some more attention being given to the gilt development in the GDU perhaps than the other system that had a higher removal rate.
All right, thank you. Let's one over here we've been a little heavy on the left. We'll get over here on the right. So we got time for maybe two more.
Yeah, good morning. Matt Ritter with United Animal Health. As I think back to the conference 4 years ago, the most impactful data set we saw was a simple two-treatment study that Dr. Rademacher presented of here's 2 choring schemes, 3-4% reduction in mortality. As we look at the last day and a half, same story, the Country View Iowa Select data. We've seen a lot of survey data, a lot of respective data analysis, organizing sows into buckets. That is useful to develop a list of hypotheses to test. But I think we've got to learn from this, and let's go into the barns and do simple 2-treatment studies under controlled conditions and answer the questions. That's what I think we've got to do is this next step to drive those improvements further in mortality is answer the questions.
Thank you. One more.
and then I'm going to react twice. First, to come back to the growth rate. It is important to not push gilts too much. But be aware also that every genetics company is also improving the growth rate on the female side. And therefore, don't retain them back too much. Personally, I have experience that if you try to do that, if you work with age-weight schedules from 10 or 15 years ago, you try to stick into that, you really have to keep them back. And it actually might lead to aggression and whatever other effects, even after at parity 3, 4, and 5. It went already wrong in the gill development. So be careful with that. Let those animals grow. They have the capacity. So that's not too bad. Make use of it as long as you develop a proper gilt and not a finishing pig that you want to use as a gilt. Reacting to the last comment, yes, I think we should look at animals. But I still come back to a comment I made earlier. We have to start reasoning from what the sow, what the animal actually needs. Because even if we improve the sow mortality rate by 4% or 5% at a certain moment, we cannot reduce even further if we don't take into account what the sow needs and give her what she needs. So I think the opportunities are limited. You will never solve sow mortality if you don't take care of the animal with proper feeding, housing, etc., etc.
All right, thank you. So we'll stop there, but before we adjourn, I just want to indicate there will be a survey that comes out afterwards. If you have other thoughts, perspectives on the conference, ideas, please enter those into that survey. And then let's also thank all the speakers from this session once more.